The Indiana Fever president stood before the cameras and told the world exactly how she saw Caitlin Clark. Not as a franchise cornerstone who needed to be protected at all costs. Not as a once-in-a-generation talent whose championship window was already ticking. She saw an element, a building block inside a 10-year brand strategy. And the moment those 4 words hit social media, a brand like Apple, everything cracked open. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a front office can do is tell the truth before they realize what they've said. What you're about to hear is not simply the story of one press conference or one unfortunate analogy. This is the story of a fundamental disconnect between what Caitlin Clark represents to millions of people and what she apparently represents to the organization running her team. Kelly Krauskopf, Indiana Fever president of basketball and business operations, made a comparison in October 2024 that spent months quietly simmering in the background. When it finally detonated, the reaction from the fan base wasn't just anger. It was recognition. It was the feeling of having been told the quiet part out loud. And when you connect those comments to a brutal injury-shortened season, a painful expansion draft, and years of recruiting success the organization didn't earn, the full picture becomes something nobody in that front office wants to acknowledge. If this is already connecting dots you've been sensing for months, hit that like button right now. It tells us you want us to keep digging into the stories everybody else keeps stepping around. Let's go back to where this story actually begins because context matters here. 6 wins, 5 wins, 13 wins. Those were the Indiana Fever's regular season records in 2021, 2022, respectively. For nearly a decade, the franchise had become professional basketball's most reliable punchline. Empty seats, zero national buzz. A team that existed in the WNBA ecosystem primarily as evidence that not every franchise deserves to keep its doors open. The cameras had moved on. The national media had no reason to show up. The front office, for all its stated ambitions, could not manufacture a single compelling reason for anyone outside central Indiana to care about what was happening in Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Then, April 2024 happened. Caitlin Clark didn't join the Indiana Fever. She detonated inside women's professional basketball. Sellout crowds in cities that had never once filled a WNBA arena for a road game. Television ratings that made executives at NBC stop treating women's basketball like a scheduling obligation and start treating it like appointment viewing. Jersey sales that shattered every record the league had ever tracked. Clark didn't raise the temperature in Indiana. She redefined what temperature was possible across the entire sport. The league's average attendance, its broadcast value, its cultural footprint, all of it shifted in a single draft cycle because one player decided this was the level she was ready to dominate. That question was mostly invisible in 2040. The Fever were riding the wave, the league was buzzing, and asking hard questions about front office philosophy seemed premature when the sellouts kept coming. The warning signs were already there. Embedded in the language of the person who was supposed to be designing Indiana's future. Hidden in plain sight until the moment they weren't. Kelly Krauskopf came to this role with legitimate credentials. She was part of the front office that constructed the 2012 championship squad, the last time Indiana held a title. When the Fever named her president of basketball and business operations, the basketball community nodded along. Here was an executive who understood what a winning culture looked like in Indiana. Her introductory press conference was covered, celebrated, and filed away. Most people moved on within a news cycle. In October 2024, that footage came back. It resurfaced on social media at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right moment, depending on your perspective, because by then, the context had changed completely. And when they went back to that October 2024 press conference with all of that context loaded in their minds, Krauskopf's words didn't land the way they had the first time. Here is what she said, that yes, Aaliyah Boston and Caitlin Clark were the team's core performers, and the organization intended to keep developing them, but that she wanted the Indiana Fever to become a long-lasting brand, like Apple, like Apple, like Apple. 2 words, that was the entire match, because the Apple analogy is not neutral. It is not a generic business comparison you can borrow without dragging in everything it implies. Apple's entire identity, its greatest era, its global dominance, its status as the most valuable company in human history, was built on one person whose vision fused so completely with the product that they became inseparable. Steve Jobs didn't work for Apple. Steve Jobs was Apple. The products were his aesthetic. The marketing was his personality. The culture was his obsession. When Jobs left the company the first time, Apple nearly went bankrupt. It wasn't until he returned that the company rebuilt into what it is today. When Krauskopf chose that specific analogy, Clark's supporters did not hear a business vision. They heard a category assignment. They heard their franchise president describe the most transformative talent the organization had ever possessed as an element. a jobs-level talent being absorbed into a brand strategy rather than being treated as the strategy herself. The reaction online was immediate and it was surgical. One fan wrote that Apple became a global icon because of Steve Jobs and that the organization's star and its identity were one and the same. Another stated plainly that the Fever would eventually admit they wasted the greatest opportunity in women's sports history. The day Clark finally decides she has had enough of a front office that sees her as a feature rather than the foundation. You do not downplay the most important player your franchise has ever had. You do not frame her as a component in a longer vision. You center everything on her, and you move fast because windows like this do not stay open. Within hours of the clip going viral, something happened that answered every question more clearly than any statement could have. Kelly Krauskopf's social media account went completely dark. Not a clarification, not a context post, not even a low-key statement about what she actually meant. Just silence where there had been an active presence just days before. There was suddenly nothing. In communications, silence is never neutral. Silence is a choice. And the choice to go dark, rather than defend or clarify a position, tells you something important about how confident the organization was in that position once the audience reaction made the stakes clear. But while the front office was absorbing the full weight of the backlash, the players who actually share a court with Caitlin Clark every night were telling a completely different story. And it was more nuanced and more revealing than either her most committed supporters or her most persistent critics had anticipated. Before we go deeper into what the players were actually saying behind the scenes, drop your read in the comments right now. When you first heard the Apple comparison, did you think it was organizational vision, or did it feel like a warning about how that front office actually sees Caitlin Clark? Hall of Famer Sheryl Swoopes gave that narrative its biggest platform on a podcast in September 2024, suggesting key players were showing quiet discontent, and that the situation around Clark had grown beyond what the roster could absorb. The story spread quickly. It became background noise that followed the Fever into their second season together, a persistent whisper that shaped how casual observers interpreted everything that happened on and off the court. Then, Lexie Hull sat down for an interview and ended that narrative with a single quote. Hull, one of Clark's closest teammates, a player with genuine daily proximity to what the culture inside that franchise actually looks like, said what almost no one wearing a Fever uniform had been willing to say publicly, that she believed there was real jealousy of the Indiana Fever across the league because of the media attention and the supporter engagement that arrived with Caitlin Clark, specifically targeting Indiana as an organization to defeat because of one player and what her success represented for the entire competitive and financial landscape of the league. Sophie Cunningham put the final piece in place from her own experience. Before she joined Indiana, while she was still in Phoenix, Cunningham heard those conversations happening firsthand. Opposing players weren't simply motivated by winning basketball games. They were motivated to make a point, to demonstrate that Clark's presence hadn't fundamentally altered the league's competitive order. The league's physical play directed at Clark throughout her seasons, aggressive enough and consistent enough that broadcasters with no rooting interest were openly questioning whether officiating standards were being applied equitably, was not random. It was the physical expression of an organizational attitude that existed across multiple franchises simultaneously. Clark herself addressed the locker room rumors in the most disarming way imaginable. She appeared on a March Madness program hosted by Diana Taurasi and handled it without a trace of the defensiveness or anger that the situation might have earned. Her framing was remarkably grounded. You get used to people believing they understand what happens behind closed doors when they have no actual information about it. That measured response from someone with every platform and every reason to go scorched earth said more than any denial could have. It was the answer of someone who had stopped caring what the wrong people thought because the right people were already in the room with her, and the evidence from inside that room kept accumulating. When Clark returned from her 25 groin injury, the injury that limited her to just 11 games before it ended her season entirely, teammates flooded the floor after playoff wins. They cut off her post-game interviews not out of resentment, but out of celebration, refusing to let her stand alone at the microphone when they wanted to be next to her. When the Fever won the Commissioner Cup, the locker room footage wasn't curated performance for a camera. The laughter was genuine. The joy between players read like people who actually wanted to be around each other, not professionals executing the appearance of team chemistry for a content team. Rookie Michaela Timpson showed real respect for Clark in a way that is genuinely difficult to manufacture. Clark posted comments on Instagram about Kristy Wallace, "Cub, I love you," and about Chloe Bibby, "My Aussie for life." Your support is what makes it possible to keep putting stories like this together, stories that go past the headlines and into what is actually happening The actual problem, the one Krauskopf's apple analogy accidentally illuminated, was always about organizational alignment. Not whether Clark's teammates liked her, but whether the people overseeing the entire operation were genuinely committed to building a championship window around a player whose timeline they don't fully control. Because Clark's 2025 season ended at 11 games due to a groin injury. And groin injuries in professional athletes at peak performance demand are not simple calendar events. They linger, they recur. They have a documented tendency to compress the windows that everyone on the outside assumes will remain open indefinitely. The urgency that Clark's most attentive supporters had been expressing about surrounding her with the right pieces, the right depth, the right defensive infrastructure, the right organizational commitment to winning now, was not emotional noise. It was basketball mathematics applied to biological reality. Then came the expansion draft. The Fever lost Bibby to Portland and Kristy Wallace to Toronto, two players Clark had publicly, personally invested in. Both losses are structurally understandable. Expansion drafts are the cost of a growing league, and every established franchise absorbs similar hits. But the optics of those specific losses landed directly on the exact question Krauskopf's October 2024 comments had raised. Are the decisions being made in Indianapolis calibrated around giving Caitlin Clark the best possible chance to win a championship during the years when she is at her absolute peak? Or are they calibrated around something else? If you've been following the Fever situation and feel like most coverage only scratches the surface, share this video with someone who deserves the full picture. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is where the real story gets tracked. Here is the paradox that makes this entire situation so revealing. Despite the front office opacity, despite the expansion draft losses, despite the injury-shortened season, and the Apple analogy controversy, Indiana had become one of the most attractive destinations in the entire WNBA. Veteran players were taking salary reductions to join the Fever roster. The environment Clark created, packed buildings in every city, national television presence, the experience of playing inside a cultural moment rather than a regular professional season, was drawing players who had legitimate alternatives. Krauskopf herself acknowledged this dynamic, noting that any intelligent basketball player who observed how Clark played would want to be alongside her. She was right. The gravitational pull of Clark's presence was executing the organization's recruiting function without any sophisticated brand strategy required. Players were choosing Indiana because of a person, not a logo, because of what it felt like to compete in that environment, not because of a decade-long vision document. The contradiction is right there on the surface. The Fever's most powerful competitive asset, the thing creating the sellouts, the television ratings, the recruiting pipeline, the cultural relevance, is a single player whose ceiling the organization still hasn't fully committed to reaching. The Apple language, the 10-year timeline talk, the framing of Clark as one of two core performers being developed, rather than as the irreplaceable center around which everything else must be constructed. All of it creates distance between the organization and the urgency the moment actually demands. Krauskopf noted during that press conference that Caitlin Clark was 10 years old when Indiana won its last title in 2012. She talked about planting seeds for a 10-year-old somewhere who would be inspired by what the Fever were building. She's the most transformative player this league has ever produced, operating at the peak of her career in a sport that is finally receiving the mainstream attention it has always deserved. Every season that passes without a championship ring is not simply a missed opportunity. It is a permanent entry in the historical record of what this organization chose to prioritize when it had everything it needed to win. The championship window does not wait for brand strategy to catch up. If this video helped you see the Fever situation from a different angle, subscribe and hit the notification bell right now, because the 2026 season is already generating serious questions about roster construction, Clark's recovery timeline, and whether the organizational decisions being made in Indianapolis today are pointed toward a championship or toward something that looks considerably less urgent. That investigation is already underway. You are going to want to be here when it drops.